All right, everyone. Tomorrow is a very special day, the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord. We're going to get into some history here because this is a fascinating subject, especially analyzing how people don't really know that much about the American Revolution, and they should know more. Lexington and Concord was an event in which local militia amassed, a fairly small number of them, and some of them got cut down by British regulars. When Paul Revere, by the way, made his famous ride, he didn't say the British are coming, because he was a British citizen. He said the regulars are coming, or perhaps the redcoats are coming. In other words, the soldiers are coming. As opposed to militia, which was fielded mainly by the colonists, to defend against attack by various so-called natives, pirates and shit like that. They formed militia groups. And the British decided to march on Lexington, cut down a small number of the militia there. They scatter. Then they march to Concord. The problem is that local militia was alerted, and all of a sudden, hundreds of militia showed up and fired at them from the tree line and basically picked them off the entire way, and about a third of their forces were destroyed. They finally get to the armory that they were trying to dismantle. They were trying to disarm the colonists. This will play a role in the analysis here as well, and found that the weapons were gone. Oh, where the fuck did they go? Turns out they buried them in like fallow fields and stuff like that. Oh, we're just harmlessly growing corn, just harmlessly growing potatoes. There's several muskets underneath the potatoes in a burlap sack, but don't think too much about it. So the British suffered a major defeat, actually, between Lexington and Concord. They won the first engagement, but the amount of casualties that they took, there are literally songs about it. The amount of casualties that they took thereafter was considered a slap in the face of the British government. What had happened is that before this, you have the Stamp Act, you have the taxes on tea, you have the Boston Tea Party and all of these other things. These agreements generally were reacted to by basic assault and things like that. Then you have all sorts of engagements between the regulars and militia at times. There were skirmishes. But Lexington and Concord, that was the big one. And that's what set off the revolution. Prior to that, for several years, the colonists had attempted to negotiate with the actual British government. They sent diplomats. They sent letters of aggrievement. They said, why are you doing this to us, particularly when British subjects in the actual British Isles, they're not subject to this bullshit. Why is our tea being taxed? Because British people, and it was mainly British diaspora, really love their fucking tea. So do I. You can get it from jamandbean.com. And by the way, they like their tea and they wanted to be able to mail things, and so they didn't like that. So they would tar and feather tax collectors. They would pour boiling tea down their throats and stuff like that. But it was semi petty, virtually. I'm sure that a lot of people got severely injured with this process going on. But it wasn't until Lexington and Concord that there was a real problem. The reason is that the local militia was stockpiling weapons and munitions. The reason for the Revolutionary War was not tea, it was not stamps, it was not the king. Actually, it was more the British Parliament than the king. They were the ones that were being pernicious. It was guns. It was munitions. It was the attempted confiscation of people's ability to defend themselves. They had a local armory set up in Concord, and the British attempted to confiscate the weapons. They were doing this because they were concerned. They were concerned about uh, at the time they were British subjects. They hadn't declared independence yet. They were concerned that they were going to arm up and form a fighting force, force them out of Boston or something like that, because they were occupying it at the time. And it was that, the shot heard around the world, had to do with guns, ironically enough. It didn't have to do with tea. And most people don't actually know this. So yes, tomorrow is a very auspicious day. We can celebrate the fact that we, I think very wisely, decided to depart from the British Empire and declare independence. This was probably a good idea. The United States has its problems, but it also has its virtues. And too often people focus on the negative, they never focus on the positive. The United States became its own empire. It became an empire in which we still have a very, very beefy militia. This is why we've never been physically invaded. The limitation was a couple of Japanese ships, I think, fired a couple of shots off the Pacific coast at one point. That's pretty much it. Since the War of 1812, the only other major incursion was due to a separation of the United States during the Civil War. Other than that, we're always on the offense, not on the defense. I mean, other than the proxy wars, which none of which I support, of course. We've got to go into Korea. We've got to go into Vietnam. We've got to drop paratroopers in Central America or something like that. Iraq, Afghanistan. Don't really support those. They're effectively proxy wars in some cases, Ukraine, for example. But yes, it is Lexington and Concord Day tomorrow, and is the 250th anniversary. Donald Trump is having Melania Trump host a series of events, actually, over the course of this year, celebrating the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. But tomorrow marks the real beginning of it. Oh, actually, that's next year. My apologies. Um, Today marks the re-beginning of the United States. Fairly auspicious when you think about it. Remember, Paul Revere didn't say the British are coming. I remember there was an Andy Griffith episode where they repeated that old line. And it's like, no, they were all British. So the British weren't coming. Which British were coming? Oh, it was the fucking regulars. That was a problem. And keep in mind, and this is something that's hilarious, the militia, because of their guerrilla tactics and partisan warfare efforts, managed to defeat probably the best trained fighting force in the world at that time. The British did have a supply line issue. Of course, they had to ship things across the entire Atlantic Ocean with old school ships, by the way. But that being said, they already had a significant number of forces available and still managed to lose against a bunch of hunters and loggers and people that were mining and shit like that, simply because they refused to give up their guns. And if only they had left them alone and said, all right, we don't really need to tax the tea. They could have focused those efforts on the French at the time, and the British Empire at the moment would probably rule the world if it weren't for the militia in the United States. They probably would literally rule the entire face of the planet. Who would have stopped them? If it weren't for having to fight on two fronts, with the British Empire on its rise, with the extra manpower and potentially manpower from the colonies, who would have opposed them? You wouldn't have had a Louisiana Purchase. You would have the British attacking New Orleans, taking that, probably burning it to the ground, and then all of a sudden riding all the way up the goddamn river. The British lost bigly because of their attempted abuse of what became Americans. That's about all. Peace out.